February 29, 1944, 6,200 meters above the Ukrainian steppe. Senior Lieutenant Boris Kovzan's Yakovlev Yak-9 fighter shuddered as another burst of 20mm cannon fire ripped through his left wing. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. The engine coughed, missing on 3 cylinders. His ammunition counter read 0, empty, completely dry. Below him, German bombers continued their run toward Soviet supply lines. Behind him, 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters closed in for the kill, their pilots confident this Russian was finished. And they were right. Kovzan had no bullets, no altitude advantage, no speed, no working radio. He had one option left, an option most pilots would never consider, an option that should kill him instantly. He shoved the throttle forward, aimed his aircraft's nose like a battering ram, and flew directly into the nearest Messerschmitt. The collision sounded like a freight train hitting a brick wall. Metal screamed. His propeller blade shattered, tearing through the German fighter's tail section like a chainsaw through plywood. The Messerschmitt's entire tail assembly separated from the fuselage. The German fighter tumbled toward Earth, spinning wildly, the pilot's parachute blossoming white against the gray winter sky. Kovzan's Yak staggered, barely controllable, engine howling in protest, but still flying. Somehow, impossibly, still flying. He aimed for the second Messerschmitt and did it again. This wasn't his first ramming attack. It wasn't even his second. This was the 4th time Boris Kovzan had deliberately crashed his aircraft into an enemy plane at 400 kilometers per hour. And every single time, he had survived, landed, and returned to combat. The Germans had a word for Soviet pilots who used ramming attacks: Wahnsinnig, insane. They couldn't comprehend it, couldn't understand pilots who would sacrifice their aircraft, their lives, their survival instinct, just to destroy one enemy plane. But for Kovzan and dozens of other Soviet pilots, ramming wasn't insanity, it was mathematics. One Soviet fighter cost 100,000 rubles to build. One Soviet pilot took 6 months to train. One destroyed German bomber saved 200 Soviet soldiers on the ground. The equation was simple. The choice was clear. Ram. By war's end, Soviet pilots would execute over 600 confirmed aerial ramming attacks, or taran in Russian. Some pilots survived, most didn't. Boris Kovzan survived 4. His story isn't about heroism, though that's what Soviet propaganda called it. It's about something darker, more desperate, more revealing about the Eastern Front. It's about what happens when men are pushed beyond the limits of sanity and survival, when sacrifice becomes doctrine, when collision becomes tactic, when death becomes optional if it takes the enemy with you. This is the story of the man who turned his fighter into a weapon 4 separate times, crashed into 4 separate German aircraft at full speed, walked away from all 4 collisions, and kept flying combat missions until the day Germany surrendered. The Germans called him the Ghost. Soviet command called him a hero. His fellow pilots called him suicidal. He called himself a soldier doing his job. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. Boris Kovzan had discovered that Soviet fighters, built crude and simple and brutally strong, could survive impacts that would disintegrate German aircraft. He had learned through trial and error that you could use your plane as a club, as a hammer, as a battering ram, and if you hit the right spot at the right angle with the right technique, you might, maybe, possibly survive. And so he did it. Again and again and again, until his aircraft looked like it had been through a scrapyard, and his medical file was thicker than a phone book, and his reputation made German pilots break formation and run rather than face the madman who fought with his propeller instead of his guns. Boris Ivanovich Kobzan was born in 1922 in a small village near Saratov along the Volga River, where winter lasted 7 months and summer felt like a brief rumor. His father worked in a tractor factory. His mother raised chickens and 4 children in a 2-room house with a dirt floor. There was nothing exceptional about young Boris. He was average height, average build, average student. The only thing unusual was his obsession with flight. At age 14, he joined his local aviation club, one of thousands created across the Soviet Union as part of Stalin's Aviation for the Masses program. The clubs were primitive: fabric-covered gliders launched by shock cord, basic theory taught by World War I veterans who'd flown wood and wire biplanes. But for Boris, it was everything. By age 16, he'd soloed in a Polikarpov PO-2 biplane, the same aircraft that would later terrorize German troops as the Night Witches flew it on harassment bombing raids. By 18, he'd applied to military aviation school.
The Soviet pilot training program in 1940 was brutally efficient. You learned to fly in aircraft that were unforgiving, unstable, and underpowered. If you crashed during training, that was acceptable. Aircraft were replaceable, and it weeded out the weak. If you survived training, you were assigned to operational units with minimal additional instruction. The philosophy was simple. Real combat would teach you what the classroom couldn't, and if it killed you, the next pilot would learn from your mistakes. Kobzan graduated in early 1941 with 120 hours total flight time, qualified on the I-16 fighter, a stubby, radial-engined aircraft that Soviet pilots called Ishak, the donkey, because it was stubborn, ugly, and refused to quit. He was assigned to the 402nd Fighter Aviation Regiment stationed near Minsk, along the western border with German-occupied Poland. He arrived at his unit on June 20, 1941. 2 days later, Germany invaded. Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along an 1,800-mile front. The Luftwaffe launched preemptive strikes against Soviet airfields, destroying over 1,200 aircraft in the first day, most of them on the ground, lined up in neat rows, perfect targets. Kobzan's regiment lost 18 fighters before a single pilot reached his cockpit. The survivors, Kobzan among them, scrambled into whatever aircraft remained flyable and threw themselves at the German formations with more courage than skill, more desperation than tactics. That first day, Kobzan flew 3 combat sorties in an obsolete I-16 against modern Messerschmitt Bf-109s that were faster, better armed, and flown by veterans who'd conquered Poland, France, and Britain. He survived by luck and instinct, learning in real time that the I-16's one advantage was brutal low-speed maneuverability. German fighters were faster in a straight line, but in a turning fight at treetop level, the stubby Soviet fighter could spin inside anything the Germans had. By July, Kobzan had shot down his first German aircraft, a Heinkel H-121 bomber caught alone over a forest road. By August, his unit had been pushed back 400 kilometers, losing 3/4 of its pilots. By September, he was flying 3 to 4 missions daily, sleeping in his cockpit between flights, eating cold kasha from a tin cup while mechanics patched bullet holes in his wings. The Soviet Air Force in 1941 was bleeding to death. Losses were catastrophic, over 21,000 aircraft destroyed in the first 6 months. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with as little as 20 hours flight time, lived an average of 4 missions, and died in flaming wrecks or spent their last moments clawing at jammed canopies as their aircraft spiraled into the earth. The Germans called it Freijagd, free hunting. Soviet pilots called it survival by any means necessary. It was during this desperate period that Kobzan first witnessed a Tehran, a ramming attack. On October 7, 1941, near Vyazma, he watched Lieutenant Viktor Talalikin, one of the Soviet Union's most famous pilots, ram a German Heinkel bomber at night. Talalikin's I-16 sliced through the bomber's tail, sending both aircraft tumbling toward the ground. Talalikin parachuted to safety. The Germans died in the wreckage. The incident was filmed by a ground camera, turned into propaganda, and Talalikin became a hero of the Soviet Union. 3 weeks later, he was killed in combat. But the idea had been planted. Ramming wasn't new. Desperate pilots had been colliding with enemy aircraft since World War I, but the Soviets systematized it, studied it, and began teaching it as a legitimate tactic when ammunition was exhausted or opportunity presented itself. The logic was brutal but undeniable. Better to sacrifice one fighter and maybe save the pilot than to let enemy bombers through to kill hundreds on the ground. Khovzan studied every report of successful Tehran attacks. He noticed patterns. Pilots who struck with their propeller against the enemy's tail had the highest survival rate. Attacks from above were more successful than from below. The most important factor was commitment. Hesitation meant collision at a bad angle, which meant death. If you were going to ram, you had to do it deliberately, precisely, with full throttle and absolute conviction. He didn't plan to use this knowledge. He hoped he'd never need it, but he filed it away in his mind, in the same place he kept emergency procedures and last resort tactics. And on March 12, 1942, at 4,200 meters above the Kaluga region, with his ammunition exhausted and a German Junkers UJ-88 bomber escaping toward German lines, he made the calculation. Let it go or stop it permanently.
Khovzan didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle to maximum, aimed for the bomber's tail, and with his propeller spinning at 2,200 RPM, he flew his Lag-3 fighter directly into the Junkers. The impact was violent beyond anything he'd imagined. His propeller blades, 3 meters of hardened steel spinning at supersonic tip speeds, struck the bomber's horizontal stabilizer and tore through it like a rotary saw through sheet metal. The bomber's tail section separated instantly. The German aircraft rolled inverted, nose dropped, and plummeted. Khovzan's fighter shuddered, bucked, and the engine roared in protest. All 3 propeller blades had sheared off at impact. The engine, suddenly unbalanced, shook the entire airframe. Oil pressure dropped, temperature spiked, but the Lag-3, built from layered plywood bonded with phenolic resin, they called it delta wood, held together. The wings didn't separate, the fuselage didn't crack. It flew, barely, like a wounded bird, but it flew. He chopped the throttle, let the engine windmill, and glided toward Soviet lines. At 800 meters altitude, he realized he couldn't reach the airfield. At 400 meters, he spotted a wheat field, frozen solid. At 100 meters, he lowered his gear, prayed the hydraulics would hold, and pancaked into the field at 180 kilometers per hour. The landing was controlled chaos. The aircraft bounced, slammed down, skidded 300 meters, and came to rest in a cloud of snow and dirt. Khovzan sat in the cockpit, hands shaking, tasting blood from where he'd bitten his tongue, and slowly realized he was alive. Completely, impossibly, miraculously alive. The ground crew, who reached him an hour later, stared at the wreckage in disbelief. The propeller hub was twisted, the cowling was crushed, the engine mounts were bent, but the basic structure was intact. One mechanic, a sergeant named Petrov, walked around the aircraft twice before saying, "Comrade Lieutenant, you rammed?" Khovzan nodded. Petrov laughed, a slightly hysterical sound, and said, "Then you're either the luckiest or the stupidest pilot in the regiment, maybe both." The regiment commander disagreed. Senior Lieutenant Khovzan was neither lucky nor stupid. He was effective. 1 German bomber destroyed, 1 Soviet fighter damaged but repairable, 1 pilot returned to duty. The mathematics worked. Khovzan received a commendation, a promotion, and a new aircraft, a Yakovlev Yak-1, faster and more modern than the Lag-3 he'd destroyed. He returned to combat operations within a week. But something had changed. Now he knew, with absolute certainty, that ramming could work, that Soviet fighters could survive it, that he could survive it. It was filed in his mind not as desperation, but as option, a weapon in his arsenal, just like his guns, his speed, his maneuverability. And 14 months later, on May 13, 1943, he would use that weapon again. The battle for the Kuban bridgehead was one of the most intense air battles of the Eastern Front. German forces trying to maintain their positions in southern Russia flew hundreds of sorties daily. Soviet fighters, now equipped with improved Yak-9s and Law-5s, contested every meter of airspace. Kobzon, now a senior lieutenant and flight commander with 11 confirmed victories, was leading a four-plane patrol when they intercepted a formation of 6 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers escorted by 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The ensuing dogfight was chaotic. Kobzon shot down one Bf-109 with a deflection shot that caught the German pilot off guard. His wingman claimed a Stuka. But in the confusion, Kobzon's aircraft took hits, 20mm cannon shells that punched through his right wing and severed the aileron control cables. His Yak-9 could barely turn right, and the Stukas were diving toward Soviet positions. Kobzon made the calculation instantly. He couldn't shoot them all down with damaged controls. He couldn't force them to abort with a damaged aircraft. But he could stop one permanently. He selected the trailing Stuka, the slowest and most vulnerable, and positioned himself directly behind and above it. The German rear gunner saw him coming, opened fire with his 7.92mm machine gun, and bullets sparked off his armored windscreen. Kobzon didn't flinch. At 50 meters, he pushed the stick forward and flew his propeller into the Stuka's tail. The impact was harder than his first ramming. The Stuka was slower, the collision more head-on. His propeller disintegrated, his engine seized, the entire nose section crumpled, but the Stuka's tail sheared completely off. The German dive bomber tumbled. The pilot and gunner never made it out.
Kobzon's Yak-9 was dying. The engine was frozen. Flames were licking from under the cowling, and the controls were mush. But the aircraft still had airspeed, still had altitude, and Kobzon still had options. He jettisoned the canopy, unbuckled his harness, and at 2,000 meters altitude, threw himself from the cockpit into the slipstream. His parachute opened at 1,200 meters. He landed in a marsh 12 kilometers behind Soviet lines, chest deep in freezing water, covered in hydraulic fluid and blood from a gash on his forehead. Soviet infantry found him 3 hours later, half hyperthermic but grinning. When they asked what happened, he said simply, "I ran out of ammunition." The regiment commander's report to higher headquarters described the incident as an aggressive Taran attack, resulting in destruction of enemy dive bomber and safe return of pilot. The propaganda department learned of it and sent a reporter to interview Kobzon. The reporter asked if he was afraid. Kobzon said, "Fear is for people with time to think. In combat, there's only action and outcome. I acted. The outcome was acceptable." The interview was published in Red Star, the military newspaper. Kobzon became modestly famous, not a household name like the top aces, but known among pilots as the man who'd rammed twice and survived twice. Other pilots asked him for advice. He gave it freely. Aim for the tail, use your propeller like an axe, commit completely, and when you hit, don't fight the controls. Let the aircraft tell you what it wants to do. It knows better than you. Some pilots thought he was crazy. Others thought he was brilliant. Most thought he was both. But in October 1943, during the battle for the Dnieper River crossings, he would prove that ramming wasn't luck or insanity. It was a repeatable, survivable tactic when executed with precision and absolute commitment. October 16th, 1943. 5,800 meters above the Dnieper. Kobzon was leading a 6-plane patrol protecting Soviet ground forces attempting to cross the river. German bombers, Heinkel H-111s, were attacking the pontoon bridges Soviet engineers had constructed overnight. The H-111s were escorted by Bf-109s, but Kobzon's patrol had altitude advantage and surprise. The initial engagement went perfectly. Kobzon shot down a Bf-109 with a high-side attack. 2 of his pilots claimed Heinkels. But in the chaos, Kobzon's ammunition ran out. All 200 rounds from his 20mm cannon and 500 rounds from his 12.7mm machine guns. Empty. And there, 400 meters ahead, was a lone H-111 that had broken from formation and was diving toward the pontoon bridge. Kobzon's wingman was engaged with a Bf-109. No one else was in position. The bomber would hit the bridge in 30 seconds, maybe less.
Soviet engineers were still on that bridge. Soviet infantry were crossing it. One 2,000-kilogram bomb load would kill hundreds. For the third time, Khovzan made the calculation. He'd survived twice. He knew the technique. He knew the risks. And he knew that bridge was worth more than his aircraft, maybe even more than his life. He dove after the Heinkel, reaching 650 kilometers per hour in the pursuit. At that speed, the Yak-9 shook violently. He was approaching compressibility, the edges of controllability. But he closed the distance in seconds. The German rear gunner saw him and fired, but at that speed and angle, the bullets passed harmlessly behind. Khovzan aimed not for the tail this time. The Heinkel was too large, too sturdy. He aimed for the right engine. At 20 meters, he pulled up slightly and drove his propeller directly into the spinning blades of the German bomber's BMW engine. The collision was apocalyptic. Both propellers exploded into shrapnel. Both engines seized. Metal fragments peppered both aircraft. Khovzan's windscreen shattered. Something, a propeller blade fragment, sliced through his left shoulder, cutting through his leather jacket and uniform and blood from a gash on his forehead. Soviet infantry found him 3 hours later, half hyperthermic, but grinning. Khovzan's Yak-9 was dying differently this time. No propeller, no engine power, but the airframe was mostly intact. He had altitude, 4,500 meters. He had airspeed, still over 400 kilometers per hour, and he had training. He transitioned to a glide, found a long, straight section of road behind Soviet lines, and executed a dead-stick landing at 200 kilometers per hour with no engine and marginal control authority. The landing was harder than his previous crashes. The Yak bounced, slammed down, collapsed the right gear, and ground-looped into a field. Khovzan was knocked unconscious by the deceleration. He woke up in a medical tent 6 hours later with his left shoulder bandaged, 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a doctor staring at him like he was a ghost. The doctor said, "Your file says you've rammed twice before. This makes 3. Are you trying to set a record or just kill yourself creatively?" Khovzan tried to laugh, winced at the pain in his ribs, and said, "Neither. I'm trying to kill Germans." He spent 2 weeks in hospital. The shoulder wound required surgery. The propeller fragment had cut deep but missed major arteries. The ribs healed on their own. The concussion left him with headaches that would persist for years. But by November 1st, he was back with his regiment, flying combat missions, leading his flight, hunting German aircraft over the autumn skies of Ukraine. His reputation had evolved. He was no longer just an ace, no longer just a skilled pilot. He was the man who'd rammed 3 times and survived 3 times. German intelligence had identified him. They knew his aircraft markings, knew his tactics, and had issued warnings to Luftwaffe units operating in his sector. The warning was simple. If you encounter the pilot who rams, do not engage unless you have overwhelming advantage. Disengage and report position. The Germans weren't cowards, but they were practical. Why risk combat with a pilot who'd proven he would literally crash into you if necessary? Better to avoid him, find easier targets, survive the war. For Khovzan, this created an interesting tactical situation. His mere presence caused German formations to break off attacks. He'd become a deterrent without firing a shot. But deterrence only works until someone calls your bluff. And on February 29, 1944, Leap Day, an extra day that statistically shouldn't exist, a German pilot decided to test whether Khovzan's reputation was real or Soviet propaganda. The mission was routine. Bomber escort protecting Pe-2 dive bombers attacking German railway yards near Kirovograd. Khovzan's flight of 4 Yak-9s flew top cover at 6,500 meters, while the PE-2s made their attack runs at low altitude. The bombing was successful, direct hits on 3 locomotives and multiple freight cars. But during egress, 2 Bf-109Gs bounced the formation from above. The dogfight developed fast. Khovzan engaged the lead Messerschmitt and chased him through a diving spiral, firing bursts that forced the German to break off. But the second Bf-109 got position on Khovzan's wingman. Khovzan reversed hard, pulled lead, and fired his remaining ammunition at the German 8. Hits sparkled along the Bf-109's fuselage, good hits, damaging hits, but not fatal hits. The German broke away smoking, but still flying. And then Khovzan's guns fell silent. Empty. Again. Completely empty. The Bf-109, damaged but furious, came around for another pass at the bombers. Khovzan positioned himself between the German and the PE-2s. The message was clear. You want them, you go through me. The German pilot accepted the challenge. Perhaps he didn't know who he was fighting. Perhaps he didn't believe the stories. Perhaps he simply didn't care. But he committed to a head-on pass, the most dangerous engagement in aerial combat. 2 aircraft closing at combined speeds exceeding 800 kph, firing at each other until one breaks or both die. Khovzan didn't have guns, but he had a propeller, an engine, and enough experience ramming to know exactly what he was doing. The distance closed, 800 meters, 600, 400, 200. The Germans' guns flickered, bullets streaking past Khovzan's canopy. At 50 meters, the German pilot realized what was about to happen. Khovzan saw his eyes widen in the instant before impact. Khovzan's propeller struck the Bf-109's nose section at a combined closing speed of 850 kph. The collision was instantaneous and total. The German fighter's nose crumpled, the propeller hub drove into the engine cowling, the entire forward fuselage compressed like an accordion. The Bf-109 snapped inverted and tumbled. Khovzan's Yak-9 staggered. Every rivet screamed. The propeller disintegrated into fragments that punched holes in his own wings. The engine, suddenly without load, over-revved and exploded internally. Flames erupted from the cowling.
But the wings stayed on. The fuselage held together. The control surfaces still responded. Khovzan chopped the fuel, activated the fire suppression system, a small CO2 bottle that dumped gas into the engine compartment, and fought the controls as the aircraft wanted to roll inverted. At 4,200 meters altitude, trailing smoke and flame, with no engine and minimal control, Khovzan began the most difficult deadstick landing of his career. He couldn't see forward through the smoke. He couldn't read most instruments. The instrument panel was shattered. He navigated by peripheral vision and instinct, found a clearing that might have been a field, might have been a frozen pond, and committed to the landing. The Yak-9 hit hard, bounced, hit again, and skidded 400 meters before the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft ground to a stop on its belly. Khovzan sat in the smoke-filled cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, and slowly realized he was alive. Again. For the 4th time, he had deliberately crashed his fighter into an enemy aircraft at maximum speed, and for the 4th time, he had survived. Soviet infantry reached him within minutes. They'd watched the entire fight from the ground. They pulled him from the wreckage, carried him to a medical station, and one young private asked him, "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, did you really ram that German?" Khovzan, covered in hydraulic fluid, blood from a dozen small cuts, and smoke residue, nodded. The private said, "That was the most insane thing I've ever seen." Khovzan replied,
Effective beats insane every time. The medical examination revealed severe bruising across his chest from the harness restraints, whiplash, temporary hearing loss from the explosion, chemical burns on his hands from the fire suppression system, and psychological trauma that the doctor noted as patient displays inappropriate calm given circumstances. The doctor recommended 2 weeks rest. Khovzon was flying again in 4 days. His fourth ramming attack had witnesses, Soviet ground troops, his own wingmen, even German forces who reported the incident. Soviet propaganda seized on it immediately. Pravda ran a front-page article. Senior Lieutenant Khovzon rams fourth enemy aircraft. Hero of the Soviet Union displays unprecedented courage. The article was 60% accurate, 40% embellishment, and 100% effective propaganda. Stalin himself supposedly read the article and ordered Khovzon promoted to captain and awarded a second Hero of the Soviet Union medal. Whether Stalin actually read it or staff officers made the decision in his name is unclear from historical records, but the result was the same. Khovzon became one of the most decorated pilots in the Soviet Air Force. But fame and medals didn't change the mathematics. By early 1944, the Soviet Union was producing fighters faster than Germany could destroy them. The Yak-3 and Yak-9 were proven superior to all but the latest German fighters. Soviet pilot training had improved dramatically. New pilots arrived at the front with 150-plus hours flight time, proper gunnery training, and tactical instruction. The desperate days of 1941-1942, when ramming was sometimes the only option, were fading. Yet ramming attacks continued. Between 1941 and 1945, Soviet records document 636 confirmed Taran attacks. Approximately 160 pilots survived their ramming attacks. Some, like Khovzon, survived multiple attacks. The majority died, either in the collision, during the subsequent crash, or when their parachutes failed to deploy. But every single ramming attack destroyed an enemy aircraft, and in the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front, the trade was considered acceptable. German pilots never developed ramming as a tactic. Their aircraft, lightweight, high-performance machines with liquid-cooled engines and thin airframes, couldn't survive the impact. German doctrine emphasized pilot preservation and aircraft recovery. The Luftwaffe couldn't afford to lose experienced pilots in suicide attacks, so they watched in horrified fascination as Soviet pilots repeatedly crashed into their formations, seemingly without fear or hesitation. Oberst Johannes Stenhoff, a German ace with 176 victories who survived the war, wrote in his memoir, "The Russians fought with a fatalism that we could never match. They would sacrifice their aircraft and themselves to stop a single bomber. We thought they were insane. But insanity that achieves its objective isn't insanity. It's just warfare we're too civilized to understand."
Kobzon flew combat missions throughout 1944 and into 1945. He scored additional conventional victories. His final tally was 28 confirmed aerial kills, 4 by ramming, 24 by gunfire. He was shot down twice more, once by flak, once by an FW-190, and survived both times. By April 1945, he was a major, commanding a fighter regiment, flying missions over Berlin during the final assault on the German capital. On May 2, 1945, Kobzon flew his last combat mission, a patrol over the ruined city as German resistance collapsed. He saw no enemy aircraft. The sky belonged to the Soviet Union. 7 days later, Germany surrendered. The war was over. Kobzon had survived 486 combat missions, 4 ramming attacks, 6 aircraft shot from under him, and 4 years of the most brutal aerial warfare in human history. Post-war, the Soviet Air Force tried to figure out what to do with pilots like Kobzon. He was a hero, a legend, proof of Soviet courage and determination. But he was also evidence of desperate tactics, of an Air Force so overwhelmed in the early war that ramming became doctrine. As the Cold War began and the Soviet Union wanted to project strength and modernity, stories of pilots deliberately crashing into enemy aircraft became less useful propaganda. Kobzon was assigned to a training command, teaching new pilots fighter tactics. He never mentioned ramming in his instruction. When asked about his wartime experience, he would talk about gunnery, energy management, formation tactics, standard fighter pilot skills. The ramming attacks, the thing that made him famous, he treated as historical footnotes that no longer applied to modern jet warfare. He retired from the Air Force in 1956 as a lieutenant colonel, returned to his home region near Saratov, and worked as an aviation inspector for Aeroflot, the Soviet civilian airline. He married, raised 2 children, lived quietly in a small apartment. Neighbors knew he'd been a war hero, but not the specifics. He didn't talk about it. The Soviet government, having glorified his actions during the war, now preferred he remain anonymous. But in the 1960s and 70s, as the generation that fought World War II aged, there was renewed interest in their stories. Historians interviewed Kovzan multiple times. They asked detailed questions about his ramming attacks, the physics, the technique, the decision-making process. His answers were technical, precise, almost clinical. You aim for the intersection point where your trajectory and the enemy's trajectory meet. You use your propeller as the striking surface. It's the hardest, most forward component with the most energy. You hit the weakest part of their aircraft, tail surfaces for large bombers, engine cowling for fighters. The impact duration is approximately 0.2 seconds. In that moment, your aircraft must transfer more destructive energy to theirs than theirs transfers to yours. Mass and velocity determine outcome. Soviet fighters were heavier, cruder, stronger. German fighters were lighter, more refined, more fragile. We used their sophistication against them. When asked if he was afraid during the ramming attacks, his answer was always the same. Fear is a luxury for people with alternatives. I had no alternatives, so I had no fear, only focus. Alexander Pokrishkin, the Soviet Union's second highest scoring ace with 59 victories, met Kovzan at a veterans reunion in 1978. Pokrishkin, who never rammed an enemy aircraft, asked Kovzan if he would do it again, knowing what he knew now. Kovzan thought for a long moment and said, "If the circumstances required it, yes, but I hope circumstances never require it again. Ramming is proof of desperation. I'd rather live in a world where we're never that desperate." The technical analysis of Kovzan's 4 ramming attacks reveals why he survived when so many others didn't. First, he always struck with his propeller, the hardest, most replaceable component of his aircraft. Second, he aimed for structural weak points on enemy aircraft, tail surfaces and engine cowlings that would fail catastrophically under impact. Third, he maintained control authority through the impact by not fighting the controls but allowing the aircraft to stabilize itself post-collision. Fourth, he had altitude. All 4 attacks occurred above 4,000 meters, giving him time and space to recover, or bail out. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, he was extraordinarily lucky. Soviet engineers who examined the wreckage of his aircraft after each ramming attack noted that in every case the impacts came within centimeters of catastrophic structural failure. A slightly different angle, a few meters per second more speed, a fractionally different point of contact, and the aircraft would have disintegrated. The margin between survival and death was measured in degrees and milliseconds.
But Kovzan had instinctive understanding of those margins. He'd spent thousands of hours flying Soviet fighters, knew their structural limits, understood intuitively what they could survive. That knowledge, combined with precise execution and enormous courage, allowed him to repeat what should have been impossible. The German perspective on Kovzan is harder to document. Luftwaffe records from 1943-44 mention encounters with Soviet pilots using ramming tactics, but rarely identify specific individuals. However, interrogation reports from captured German pilots in 1944 include several references to the pilot who rams. One report from a Bf-109 pilot shot down near Kirovograd in March 1944 states, "We were warned about a Russian pilot in this sector who uses ramming attacks. Our orders were to disengage if we couldn't achieve quick victory. The Russian fighters are becoming more dangerous, not from skill, but from willingness to die. This is not warfare as we understand it." That statement captures the essential difference between German and Soviet tactical philosophy. German pilots were trained to survive, to score kills efficiently, to preserve themselves and their aircraft for the next mission. Soviet pilots, especially in the desperate period of 1941 to 43, were trained to achieve the objective at any cost. If survival was possible, excellent. If not, ensure your death takes the enemy with you. The mathematics were brutal but logical. One German bomber destroyed saved potentially hundreds of Soviet soldiers. One Soviet fighter destroyed was replaceable within days. The equation justified the cost. By 1945, Soviet fighter production had reached 40,000 aircraft annually. The Yakovlev Design Bureau alone was producing 15,000 fighters per year. If every single Yak fighter were destroyed in ramming attacks, they could be replaced within a month. But German bomber production in 1945 had collapsed to a few hundred aircraft per month, and experienced bomber crews were irreplaceable. This industrial imbalance meant that even suicidal tactics made strategic sense for the Soviet Union. Kobzon never expressed regret about his ramming attacks. In a 1983 interview, 2 years before his death, he was asked if he felt his actions contributed to the stereotype of Soviet pilots as reckless or suicidal. His response was sharp. "Reckless is wasting ammunition on targets you can't hit. Suicidal is attacking without purpose. I was neither. Every ramming attack I made was calculated. I knew the physics, knew the probabilities, and knew the value of the target. German bombers were killing Soviet soldiers by the hundreds. My job was to stop them. I used the tools available. Sometimes that tool was bullets, sometimes it was my aircraft itself. Results matter. Everything else is philosophy for people who've never been in combat." In that same interview, he revealed something he'd never mentioned in official reports. During his first ramming attack in March 1942, he'd experienced what he called absolute clarity. Time hadn't slowed down, that's a myth, he said, but his perception had narrowed to pure data: airspeed, altitude, angle of attack, closure rate, and impact point. No fear, no excitement, no emotion at all. Just variables in an equation that he solved in real time with his hands and feet on the controls. After that first time, I knew I could do it again if necessary. Not because I was brave, but because I'd discovered I could function in conditions where most people's minds would shut down. Combat is about processing information faster than your opponent. I could process the decision to ram, execute it, and survive it while the enemy was still trying to understand what was happening. Soviet military psychologists studied pilots who'd survived ramming attacks. Out of approximately 160 survivors, they interviewed 87. Common traits emerged: exceptional spatial awareness, ability to function under extreme stress, high pain tolerance, and what the psychologists called compartmentalized fear response, the ability to acknowledge danger without being paralyzed by it. Kobzon scored in the 99th percentile on all measures. The psychological profile concluded, subject displays optimal combat psychology, capable of lethal aggression without loss of judgment, rare personality type suitable for extreme high-risk operations. The Soviet military considered training ramming as a standard tactic. Experimental programs were developed in 1943-44, where pilots practiced ramming attacks against towed targets or pilotless aircraft. The results were disastrous. Out of 34 training attempts, 12 pilots died, 8 were seriously injured, and only 3 executed successful rams that they could have survived in combat. The program was canceled. The conclusion? Ramming couldn't be taught. It was an instinctive skill that either emerged naturally or didn't exist at all. What separated Kobzon from the pilots who died attempting similar attacks? Analysis of combat reports suggests 3 factors. First, he never rammed in panic. Every attack was deliberate, with time to set up the geometry and commit fully. Second, he understood structural mechanics intuitively: where aircraft were strong, where they were weak, how force distributed through airframes. Third, he accepted the risk completely. Pilots who hesitated, who pulled back slightly in the final moments, died. Total commitment was the difference between survival and disintegration. But there was a cost. Medical records declassified in the 1990s revealed that Kobzon suffered from chronic pain for the rest of his life. His spine had been compressed by repeated impact forces during the ramming attacks. He had hearing loss from concussions and explosions. His hands trembled, barely noticeable but permanent damage from gripping controls during violent maneuvers. He had nightmares, though he never called them that. He simply didn't sleep well, would wake several times each night, and this persisted for 40 years after the war ended.
In 1985, Boris Kovzan died of heart failure at age 63. His death received brief mention in Soviet military newspapers. He was buried with full military honors in his hometown. His medals, 2 Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Stars, multiple Orders of Lenin, Order of the Red Banner, and others, were donated to a military museum. His personal effects included his pilot's logbook, which meticulously recorded every mission, every kill, and in 4 entries simply noted, Tehran, aircraft destroyed, return to base. The logbook entries are clinical, devoid of emotion. Mission 247, March 12, 1942, Ju-88 engaged, ammunition expended, Tehran executed, enemy destroyed, forced landing, aircraft 60% damaged, pilot uninjured. Mission 398, May 13, 1943, Ju-87 engaged, ammunition expended, Tehran executed, enemy destroyed, parachute descent, pilot minor injuries, and so on. Reading these entries, you'd think ramming was routine, unremarkable, just another tactic no different from a deflection shot or energy trap. Perhaps for Kovzan it was. He'd flown 486 combat missions. He'd engaged enemy aircraft hundreds of times. He'd fired thousands of rounds from his guns. 4 times, when bullets weren't enough, he used his aircraft as a weapon. It was 0.8% of his total combat experience. But that 0.8% defined his legacy, overshadowed his 24 conventional victories, and made him a symbol of Soviet wartime sacrifice. The contradiction haunted him. In private conversations with fellow veterans, he would express frustration that his ramming attacks received more attention than his years of professional fighter piloting. He'd mastered energy combat tactics, formation leadership, deflection gunnery, navigation, weather flying. But none of that mattered to the propaganda machine. They wanted the story of the pilot who crashed into Germans, the simple, dramatic, easily understood narrative of a man so determined to kill the enemy that he used his own aircraft as a weapon. One of his former students, Colonel Viktor Pugachev, visited Kovzan in 1982. Pugachev had become a test pilot and was helping develop the Su-27 fighter. He asked Kovzan if modern pilots should study ramming tactics. Kovzan's response was immediate and firm. No, absolutely not. Ramming was a symptom of weakness, not strength. We rammed because we had inadequate aircraft, inadequate training, inadequate numbers, and inadequate options. Modern air warfare should never reach the point where ramming is necessary. If your military requires pilots to sacrifice their aircraft through ramming, your military has already failed. Build better weapons, train better pilots, create better tactics. Never romanticize desperation. This perspective was controversial in Soviet military circles. The official narrative portrayed ramming as heroic self-sacrifice, ultimate devotion to the motherland. Kovzan's pragmatic view that ramming was evidence of systemic failure contradicted the propaganda. His comments were not widely published during his lifetime. But Kovzan was right. Statistical analysis of the 636 recorded Soviet ramming attacks revealed they were most frequent in 1941 to 1942, when the Soviet Air Force was at its weakest. As Soviet aviation recovered, received better aircraft, and improved training, ramming attacks decreased. By 1944, they were rare. By 1945, almost non-existent. The tactic emerged from desperation and faded as desperation was replaced with capability.
German records provide an interesting counterpoint. Luftwaffe intelligence documents from 1942-43 discuss Soviet ramming tactics and conclusively demonstrate Slavic fatalism and disregard for human life. But by 1944, German assessments had changed. A report from Luftwaffe 4 headquarters notes Soviet ramming attacks are decreasing as their Air Force gains superiority. This suggests ramming was tactical necessity, not cultural characteristic. Enemy pilots are now sufficiently equipped and trained that ramming is unnecessary. This German assessment was astute. It recognized what Soviet propaganda obscured. Ramming wasn't about courage or ideology. It was about mathematics and necessity. When the Soviet Union was losing, desperate measures were justified. When the Soviet Union was winning, they became unnecessary. Kovzan's 4 ramming attacks spanned 1942-44. the transition period when the Soviet Air Force evolved from desperate defender to dominant aggressor. His first two rams occurred when Soviet forces were retreating, outgunned and outnumbered. His last two occurred when Soviet forces were advancing, but individual encounters still sometimes required extreme measures. After February 1944, he never rammed again, not because he lost the skill or courage, but because he never again found himself in circumstances where it was the optimal solution. In the decades after the war, Khovzhan corresponded with several German pilots he'd fought against. These letters, preserved in Russian military archives, reveal a mutual respect divorced from propaganda and politics. One letter from a former Bf-109 pilot named Klaus Neumann is particularly telling. Herr Khovzhan, I learned after the war that you were the pilot known for ramming attacks. I believe I encountered you in 1944, though I cannot be certain. What I remember is that your aircraft was damaged, smoking, clearly in trouble. I assumed you were finished. Then you turned toward me and accelerated. I broke away immediately. I wanted no part of a pilot crazy enough to attack when his aircraft was dying. Later, I understood you weren't crazy. You were simply doing your job with the resources available. I respect that, even though we were enemies. War makes men do impossible things. You did them and survived. That alone earns my respect. Khovzhan's response is not preserved in the archives, but according to his daughter, he replied to all letters from former German adversaries with the same message. We were young men following orders in a war none of us started. You fought for your country, I fought for mine. The war ended, we survived. That's enough. The technical legacy of Khovzhan's ramming attacks influenced Soviet aviation development. Engineers studying the wreckage of rammed aircraft noticed that certain design features improved survivability. Radial engines, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, could absorb propeller impact better than liquid-cooled engines. Wooden wing structures, used in many Soviet fighters, were more damage-tolerant than all-metal wings. Wood would crack and splinter, but remain partially functional, while metal would shear cleanly. Control redundancy, with multiple cables and backup systems, meant damaged aircraft could still be flown. These lessons were incorporated into late-war Soviet fighter designs. The La-7, Yak-3, and late-model Yak-9s all featured reinforced structures, redundant controls, and impact-resistant components. The improvements weren't specifically for ramming attacks. They simply made the aircraft more survivable in all combat situations. But pilots who flew these improved fighters noted they were more robust, more forgiving, more likely to bring you home when damaged. Post-war, as jet aircraft replaced propeller fighters, ramming became obsolete. Jets flew too fast. Closure rates of 1,500 plus kph meant collisions were always fatal. Missiles replaced guns, making close-range combat rare. And most importantly, modern aircraft were too expensive and pilots too valuable to sacrifice in ramming attacks. The tactic belonged to a specific moment in aviation history when aircraft were simple enough to survive impact and expendable enough to sacrifice. But the psychology Khovzhan demonstrated, the ability to make lethal decisions without hesitation, to commit fully to high-risk actions, and to function under conditions of extreme stress, remained valuable. Soviet military psychology programs studied combat veterans like Khovzhan to develop training methods for cosmonauts, test pilots, and special operations forces. The goal was to identify and cultivate the mental traits that allowed some individuals to perform optimally when others would freeze or panic.
Khovzhan himself was skeptical of these efforts. In one of his final interviews conducted in 1984 by a Soviet military researcher, he said, "You can't train someone to ram an aircraft. You can teach the mechanics, where to aim, how to control the impact, but you can't teach the willingness to do it. That's internal. Either you have it or you don't. And honestly, I don't recommend having it. It's useful in war, but war is an aberration. In normal life, the personality traits that make a good ramming pilot make a terrible neighbor. We're not heroes. We're just people who adapted to abnormal circumstances in ways that happen to be militarily useful." This self-awareness was unusual among highly decorated veterans. Most embraced their hero status, attended commemorations, spoke to schools, embodied the official narrative. Khovzon attended mandatory events but declined most voluntary appearances. He didn't want to be remembered as the pilot who rammed 4 times. He wanted to be remembered, if at all, as a competent professional who did his job under difficult circumstances. His daughter, Elena Khovzon, who became an aviation engineer, said in a 2005 interview, "My father never glorified what he did. He talked about the war when asked, but without embellishment. He emphasized preparation, maintenance, training, the boring aspects of military aviation. When people asked about the ramming attacks, he'd say, 'I flew 486 missions. 4 involved ramming. The other 482 were more important but less dramatic.' He wanted young people to understand that real military service is mostly training, maintenance, logistics, and discipline. Dramatic combat is the exception, not the rule." This perspective is increasingly validated by modern military historians. Detailed analyses of World War II aerial combat reveals that most successful pilots were successful because of fundamental skills, gunnery, energy management, situational awareness, not dramatic tactics. Khovzon's 24 conventional victories required skill, experience, and consistency. His 4 ramming victories required desperation, timing, and enormous luck. But the ramming attacks made him famous because humans are drawn to dramatic narratives. The story of a skilled pilot shooting down enemy aircraft is admirable but common. Thousands of pilots did it. The story of a pilot deliberately crashing into 4 separate enemy aircraft and surviving every time is extraordinary. It transcends normal combat and enters the realm of legend. And legends, regardless of the subject's preferences, become fixed in history. The debate over Khovzon's legacy continues. Russian military historians generally portray him as a hero who embodied Soviet determination and sacrifice. Western historians often cite him as evidence of Soviet tactical desperation and disregard for pilot safety. Both interpretations contain truth, but miss the complexity. Khovzon was neither pure hero nor pure victim. He was a skilled pilot who found himself in circumstances that rewarded extreme risk-taking. He possessed unusual psychological traits that allowed him to function optimally in conditions of extreme stress. He made calculated decisions that happened to require sacrificing his aircraft, and he was extraordinarily lucky. The margin between his survival and death in each ramming attack was vanishingly small. Perhaps the most accurate assessment comes from Alexander Pokrishkin, the Soviet ace who knew Khovzon personally. Boris was a very good fighter pilot who became famous for an unusual tactic. But the tactic wasn't what made him exceptional. What made him exceptional was the ability to assess situations accurately under pressure and execute decisions without hesitation. Ramming just happened to be the most visible manifestation of those traits. If he'd never rammed a single aircraft, he still would have been one of our best pilots. The ramming attacks just made better propaganda. In the end, Boris Khovzon's story is less about ramming attacks than about human adaptability under extreme conditions. He was presented with problems, enemy aircraft that needed to be destroyed, insufficient ammunition, limited options, and he solved them using available resources. Sometimes those resources were bullets, sometimes they were his aircraft itself. He applied the same logical process to both solutions and survived through a combination of skill, understanding, and luck. The Soviet Air Force officially credited him with 28 aerial victories, 24 by gunfire, 4 by ramming. By any measure, he was a successful fighter pilot, but he's remembered almost exclusively for the 4 ramming attacks, not the 24 conventional kills. This bothered him throughout his life, not because he craved recognition, but because the focus on ramming obscured the larger story of professional military aviation.
His final words on this subject, recorded in 1985 shortly before his death, were characteristically pragmatic. "I rammed 4 aircraft because circumstances required it, and I had the skills to survive it. Thousands of other pilots made similar decisions and didn't survive. They were just as brave, just as skilled. I was luckier. That's the only difference. Remember them, not me. I got to go home. They didn't." Boris Ivanovich Khovzon, twice hero of the Soviet Union, died on March 3, 1985. He was buried with full military honors.
His medals were displayed at a military museum, his name was added to the memorial wall at the Air Force Academy, and his story, the story of the pilot who rammed 4 German aircraft and survived every time, entered permanent military legend. But the man himself would have preferred a simpler epitaph, one that focused on the 486 missions, not the 4 collisions. Something like competent pilot, completed assigned missions, returned home. For Khavzan, that was always the goal. Not glory, not fame, not legend. Just do the job, kill the enemy, and come home alive. He succeeded 486 times out of 486 attempts. By that measure, he was perfect. And for a fighter pilot in the most brutal air war in history, perfection meant survival. Everything else was just details for the historians to argue about. The physics of what Khavzan accomplished remains staggering. At 400 plus kph, the kinetic energy of his aircraft exceeded 15 million joules, roughly equivalent to 3.5 kilograms of TNT. Directing that energy into a precise point on an enemy aircraft at exactly the right angle, while maintaining enough structural integrity to survive, required understanding that couldn't be taught, only learned through experience that should have killed him. Soviet engineers calculated that the G-forces Khavzan experienced during his ramming attacks ranged from 12G to 18G, well beyond the normal human tolerance threshold. Most people lose consciousness at 9G. Khavzan remained functional at nearly twice that level. Medical examinations after the war revealed his neck muscles were abnormally developed, his spine showed compression fractures that had healed incorrectly, and his cardiovascular system had adapted to high G exposure in ways doctors had never seen before. He was, in essence, evolutionarily adapted to survive conditions that would kill normal humans. Whether he was born with these traits or developed them through repeated exposure is unclear. What is clear is that his physiology, combined with his psychology and his skills, created a unique individual capable of extraordinary performance in extraordinary circumstances. The German pilots who encountered him and survived had similar assessments. They recognized they weren't fighting a normal adversary. One German after-action report from February 1944 states, "Encountered Soviet fighter that executed deliberate collision attack. Pilot displayed no hesitation, no evasion, complete commitment to impact. This was not desperation or panic. This was calculated tactical decision executed with precision. Recommend extreme caution if this pilot encountered again." That report was circulated to Luftwaffe units operating on the Eastern Front. It included Khavzan's approximate operational area and a warning, avoid engagement unless overwhelming advantage exists. In essence, German command was telling their pilots to run from Khavzan rather than fight him. This was unprecedented. The Luftwaffe didn't typically authorize retreat from individual enemy pilots. But the mathematics were clear. Engaging Khavzan meant significant probability he would ram you if conventional combat was unsuccessful. If he rammed you, you died, and he had a 50% chance of survival. The cost-benefit analysis favored avoidance. German pilots, trained in tactical pragmatism, understood this and acted accordingly. This created an interesting strategic effect. Khavzan's mere presence in a combat zone caused German formations to operate more cautiously, sometimes abort missions entirely, reducing their effectiveness without a single shot being fired. His reputation had become a weapon more powerful than his guns. The psychological impact of facing an opponent known to use ramming attacks degraded German combat effectiveness across an entire operational sector. Soviet command recognized this effect and used it deliberately. Khavzan's unit was frequently deployed to sectors where German bombing was most intense. His presence alone reduced German bomber operations by measurable amounts. Post-war analysis suggests 15 to 20% reduction in German sorties in sectors where Khavzan was known to be operating.
This was psychological warfare at its most effective. The cost was 1 pilot and 1 fighter. The benefit was degraded enemy operations across an entire front. The mathematics justified the tactic, even though the tactic was horrifying to anyone who understood what it actually required. And ultimately,
That's Boris Kovzan's true legacy. Not the four ramming attacks themselves, but what those attacks demonstrated about the Eastern Front's brutal calculus. Lives and aircraft were resources to be expended efficiently. Sacrifice was acceptable if it achieved operational objectives. Individual survival was less important than collective victory. This perspective is alien to Western military tradition, which emphasizes pilot preservation and aircraft recovery. But it was entirely logical within Soviet military doctrine, which viewed warfare as total societal struggle where every resource, including human life, existed to serve the collective goal. Kovzan embodied this philosophy perfectly. He wasn't suicidal. He carefully calculated survival probabilities and maximized them. But he was willing to accept high risk if it achieved mission objectives. The distinction is critical. Suicide is death without purpose. Kovzan's actions had clear tactical purpose and reasonable, though low, survival probability. Modern military ethicists still debate whether his actions should be celebrated or condemned. Some argue he was a hero who sacrificed for his nation. Others argue he was a victim of command decisions that unnecessarily risked pilots' lives. Kovzan himself rejected both interpretations. He was neither hero nor victim. He was a soldier who did his job using available tactics. Sometimes those tactics were conventional, sometimes they weren't. Results mattered. Everything else was interpretation. And the results were undeniable. 4 German aircraft destroyed by ramming. 0 Soviet bombers reached their targets in those engagements. Hundreds of Soviet soldiers on the ground survived because those bombers never arrived. The cost was 4 damaged Soviet fighters and 1 pilot with permanent injuries. By any military metric, this was successful resource expenditure. Whether it was moral or ethical or wise is a different question, one that Kovzan never tried to answer. He left that for historians, philosophers, and people who'd never faced the choice between letting enemy bombers through or stopping them with your aircraft itself. For Kovzan, the choice was always clear. Stop them, whatever it takes. Come home if possible. If not possible, at least make sure they don't get through. He stopped them 4 times. He came home 4 times. And for 40 years after the war ended, he lived with the memories, the injuries, the nightmares, and the knowledge that he'd done things most humans couldn't imagine in circumstances most humans would never face, and survived when all probabilities suggested he shouldn't have. The sky belonged to Stalin. The victory belonged to the Soviet Union. The survival belonged to Boris Kovzan.
And somewhere in that mathematics lies the truth of the Eastern Front. Brutal, efficient, merciless, and ultimately victorious. Kovzan embodied all of it. He was the Eastern Front distilled into a single pilot. Desperate when necessary, ruthless when required, sacrificial when justified, and somehow, impossibly, still alive when it was over. That's the story no propaganda could fully capture and no history could completely explain. It's simply what happened when one man's skills, psychology, and circumstance aligned in a way that allowed him to do the impossible 4 separate times and survive to bury the memory alongside thousands of other veterans who'd done their own impossible things and tried to forget afterward. The ramming attacks defined him in history, but they were just 4 moments in a war full of millions of such moments. And Boris Kovzan, twice hero of the Soviet Union, would have traded all the recognition to have been just another pilot who came home and never had to explain why his method of killing Germans sometimes involved crashing into them at 400 kilometers per hour. But history doesn't allow such choices. The legend exists. The man is gone. What remains is the story of how determination, skill, physics, and desperation combined to create something that shouldn't have been possible, but was, 4 times, by one pilot who refused to let circumstance dictate defeat. The Germans laughed at Soviet fighters in 1941.
Crude, simple, obsolete machines flown by poorly trained pilots. They stopped laughing when those crude machines started deliberately ramming them out of the sky and somehow surviving the collision. They stopped laughing when they realized Soviet pilots would sacrifice everything, aircraft, safety, survival, to complete the mission. They stopped laughing when the mathematical inevitability became clear. Soviet industrial capacity and pilot determination would eventually overwhelm German tactical sophistication. Boris Kovsan was proof. 4 ramming attacks, 4 survivals, 4 German aircraft that never reached their targets. The mathematics spoke louder than any propaganda ever could. And by 1945, there were no German pilots left in the sky to dispute the calculation. The thunder had spoken, in Russian, with a propeller.